This is Vivica Williams, and you're watching Head to Head. For the first time in 4 years, German Chancellor Angela Merkel has arrived in Kyiv on an official visit. She was met by Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, and on the agenda were at least the Minsk agreements and new evidence of Russian crimes against Ukraine. To talk more about this, we're welcomed to the studio today Oleksandr Khara, expert on foreign and security policy at the Maidan of Foreign Affairs. Hello, and thank you for joining us,
Oleksandr. Thank you for having me.
Well, as we said, this is the first time in 4 years, we could say since the start of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, that Merkel has visited the country. And can you tell us what does this tell you, and what do you see coming out of this meeting?
First of all, inspired that this is second or third visit of Mrs. Merkel from this time. It doesn't mean that our president hasn't met her in other occasions. There was more than a dozen occasions where they met to discuss first and foremost Russian aggression against Ukraine, and certainly the way how to stop the war.
But coming to Ukraine has been something that hasn't happened from her in 4 years.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. She came to Kyiv, and on the eve of this visit, she just declared that she's not going to run for the office in 2021, which is a bit shifting her agenda to Ukraine as well, in a positive way. So I believe that one of the key messages of Ms. Merkel in Ukraine is that there is a strong support from Germany and the European Union in general towards Ukrainian, transformation, economic transformation, political transformation within Ukraine, and certainly on our way to Europe and in our efforts to withstand Russian aggression. So this is a key issue that she was pushing here, and one of the key elements of it, and possibly it will be, let's say, the cornerstone of her policy towards Russia, is to push Russia to stop this war in this short period of time.
And one of the, and speaking of that, one of the major discussions is about the Minsk agreements and the enforcing of them on this side. And that has to do with Ukraine and Russia's commitment. And both Merkel and Poroshenko had something to say about this during a press conference. So let's have a listen to that now. We are also working towards deploying a UN mission in Donbas to achieve peace. Talks also involve the issue of local elections that do not comply with Minsk agreements. I know how hard it was to prolong the special status of the Donbas, and I am very grateful to members of parliament for that.
The issue of stopping Russian aggression was central to our talks. We have discussed the situation in Donbas and Crimea. I have reaffirmed the dedication of Ukraine to implement Minsk agreements and readiness of Ukraine to deliver on the obligations to assure security according to the agreements, so that we could move on to the political component.
Right, so let's talk about their words a little bit. Now, Merkel brought up the issue of a peacekeeping mission. And how realistic do you think this is? I mean, she brought this up. Are we looking at more concrete steps towards this based on her words?
Well, I am a bit skeptical about the possibility of deploying peacekeeping mission for several reasons. First and foremost, we've got OSCE mission on the ground with a mandate to cover the whole territory of Ukraine, including the state border between Ukraine and Russia. And Russia is making it impossible for them to monitor and to influence so-called separatists, but in reality Russian proxies on the ground. So there is no need to deploy another mission, UN peacekeeping mission, to do the job that our OSCE staffers are supposed to do.
Now, well, speaking just on that, Alexander Hugh, in his retirement words, he's saying it seems that he does not believe that the OSCE can bring this to an end. From his wording, he says that it must be a decision of the parties. Either Russia can decide to end this if they want to.
That's right.
So if there's the thought that the OSCE may not be able to make any difference in this conflict, would you see that a peacekeeping force would have any different outcome?
No, not at all. The only person who can stop this war just in 24 hours is Mr. Putin. And peacekeeping mission, UN peacekeeping mission, could be a sort of the tool how to save his face and how to withdraw without consequences for his political, let's say, future within Russia and on the international scene. So I see no appetite from Mr. Putin to stop this war. And I believe that he thinks that the time on his side, and in the long run, he can overplay Ukraine and our allies in the West, because there was a president of France, François Hollande, and he has gone. Now, in 2 years, Ms. Merkel will leave the office. Mr. Obama has left the White House. So Mr. Putin is in the Russian government since 2000, so for 18 years. And he believes that he can divide the European Union within itself and divide Europeans from the Americans. And it will help him to get Ukraine back into the sphere of his influence.
He's trying to use democracy against Europe and against the U.S.
That's right. That's why I see no prospects of deploying peacekeeping mission on the ground, because it's not time for Mr. Putin to consider that the price of this ongoing conflict is too high. It's according to the estimates of experts, it's something like $2 billion per year for all those so-called republics, and certainly there are a lot of money for occupied and annexed Crimea. And it's actually a bearable price for Putin and for his goal to restore the superpower status of Russia. That's why I see no prospects of any kind in Donbas in the nearest future. Before our elections, it's for sure, because this conflict, and especially fighting in the east, would be used as a tool to destabilize the situation in the mainland of Ukraine, not occupied by Russia.
And what were some of the other issues you think Merkel has brought up to try to counter this, to be able to address this? Of course, there's a lot of discussion about the Minsk agreements, but that is an issue for which has been always the enforcement of the Minsk agreements and the carrying out on both sides of this.
I'm skeptical about the so-called Minsk agreements or arrangements as well, since it hasn't brought even the ceasefire to the sides, I mean the Ukrainian and Russian side. And that's why we should think about the other options, and I believe there are such options. It's possible for Mr. Putin and his establishment to use the lack of unity within Ukrainian political elite to undermine our sovereignty and certainly political process here. If there is such a thing like a unity, it's more difficult for Putin to exploit. Secondly, it's armament of Ukrainian armed forces and strengthening our ability just to prevent further escalation and further advancement of the Russian forces into the Ukrainian territory. Thirdly, it's a political and legal procedures within Ukrainian legislation, and most importantly on the international scene, how to make Russia to admit that it's a part of this conflict. It's not a sort of support of so-called separatists. So this is the only way how we can bring Russia to justice, to admit that it's a part of conflict and actually the root of conflict, and then to agree also, let's say, peaceful agreement with Russia on some terms acceptable for Ukrainian side.
And how likely do you think that it is that Russia will admit their involvement or at any time?
Well, it's difficult, but it's possible to do via, first and foremost, General Assembly of the United Nations. We know that it's impossible to push any type of such resolutions within the UN Security Council for obvious reason, but providing evidence of the Russian interference and Russian aggression and the war against Ukraine in different international fora. And certainly some cases that we already won in the international courts, and ongoing cases could be used as an argument for that. Certainly, Russia needs to realize that there is no possibility to impose its will on Ukraine, to limit our sovereignty, and that we have a will to resist, and we have a support and coalition of friends of Ukraine in European Union and elsewhere in the world. And it will bring Putin to understand that it's better to seize the conflict and to find a political solution, as we call it, to Donbas.
And let's talk about some of the other issues that are being brought up in this meeting between Poroshenko and Merkel. One of the other issues may be to have to deal with the economic relationship between the two countries.
Well, sure. Germany is one of the key partners within the European Union, and we've seen increased trade over between the countries within this year. Certainly, it's not in the full potential of our countries. With some changes to Ukrainian policy and legislation, with bringing this business environment up to the acceptable for foreign investment level, would boost these relations. And we've seen some improvements, and Ms. Merkel was talking about this, was talking about support, not just to improve our infrastructure, but to change the governmental policies and attitudes towards, she proposed to send an envoy on decentralization issues, which is a really important thing for Ukraine. It's not in federalization, it's the devolution of the powers to the local authorities, which is absolutely in interest of Ukrainian nation.
And how would you estimate overall the meeting between the two?
Well, it was in a warm, I would say, environment. They were meeting and talking to each other like friends. I am not going to overestimate the personal touch and bromance between them. Certainly, Poroshenko and Merkel are guided by the national interest, the interest of the whole Europe, and that's why there are some disagreements, and certainly there are some critical words towards each other. But in general, the mood was positive, and certainly we see Germany as a friend that supports us in various ways.
Well, thank you very much for being with us today, Oleksandr, and bringing some insight into this meeting. Thank you. And that was Oleksandr Khara, expert on foreign and security policy at the Maidan of Foreign Affairs. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned with UATV for more.